So the FISA memo that has been talked about so much in Washington for the better part of a month now is about to hit the public eye. This is Fox News coverage of the controversial release of that FISA memo. The House Intelligence Committee has now declassified the memo containing details on alleged surveillance abuse. I'm John Scott in New York. Our Catherine Herridge is our chief intelligence correspondent and has some inkling of what this memo contains. And it really starts with that Fusion GPS dossier that was compiled by then candidate Donald Trump, Catherine.
Okay, so Fox News can now confirm, John, that the 4-page memo has been declassified, and notification or certification, if you will, came in a letter from the White House. That means these documents will now be available publicly for every American to read. We understand, based on our reporting, that there are some key findings in this memo, and one has to do with this anti-Trump dossier and how it was used to obtain surveillance warrant during the 2016 campaign. We understand that a very senior law enforcement official at the FBI sought a surveillance warrant and told the committee, the House Intelligence Committee, it would not have been possible without the use of this dossier. That's important because the dossier was funded by the Clinton campaign as well as the DNC. We also understand, based on our reporting this morning, that this kind of information about the sourcing and the financing of the dossier was not shared with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that provides the ability of law enforcement to track the communications of American citizens. We also understand the FBI and Department of Justice relied in part on media reporting to lend credibility to the dossier, and the issue there is that the firm behind the dossier had been briefing reporters, about a half-dozen major American media outlets, about the dossier, so it does appear that there was circular reporting in this case. We also understand, based on the information we've gathered, that once the British spy's contact was cut off with the FBI over his connections with media and other reporters, he continued to funnel information into the FBI through a Justice Department contact, Bruce Orr. Bruce Orr has since been demoted when these revelations came to light, and it's important to note that Bruce Orr's wife also worked for the same opposition research firm. We also understand that there is information in the memo that indicates that the British spy who compiled the research had, for a lack of a better term, a severe dislike, an agenda against then-candidate Trump, and was working in part to be sure that he would not be elected president of the United States. So the bottom line we can say from our reporting this morning is that the memo has been declassified. The key highlights relate to the use of this Trump dossier to obtain a surveillance warrant, at least one warrant, from this National Security Court, and that the National Security Court didn't have the full picture about sources, methods, and who was financing the dossier. Now, just for some context, Democrats have said that they feel the 4-page memo is not accurate and its findings are exaggerated because key facts are missing. So it's going to be important to see what the Democratic response is and to what extent it undercuts the claims that are in the memo, John.
But from what you're telling us, the indications from this memo are that the surveillance would not have been approved of the Trump campaign or members of the Trump campaign absent this dossier that was prepared by Fusion GPS and paid for by the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign.
Based on my reporting, one of the question marks for investigators is at what point the FBI and Justice Department made that connection between the dossier and the DNC and the Clinton campaign. And based on my reporting, no one's been able to really give them a firm answer on when that was known to them, because that would be the data point at which they should have shared this information with the National Security Court that's in charge of getting warrants for surveillance. But that is one of the big headlines, that absent the dossier, they would not have obtained at least one of the surveillance warrants in this case.
Fusion GPS is headed by Glenn Simpson. He's a former Wall Street Journal reporter, and you're saying that Fusion GPS was trying to get this dossier published by major American news outlets. He was meeting with reporters and saying, here, look, I've got this great stuff, you should publish it.
So there's a defamation suit that's going on in the British courts that has to do with the publication of the dossier by BuzzFeed. A number of Russian businessmen are suing, among others, because of the allegations that were contained in the dossier they say are false, and libeled them. What we've learned through the British court records is that in the months leading up to the presidential election, especially from about September onwards, there was a concerted campaign by Fusion GPS, along with the British spy Christopher Steele, to brief the findings of the dossier with major American media outlets. For the most part, these outlets did not run with the story prior to the election. There was one or two pieces of reporting that this intelligence or that this report the dossier may exist. But what's going on here is that you had a situation where the FBI and Justice Department, based on what we've learned so far, was using media reports to lend credibility to the dossier when they applied for these surveillance warrants. But at the same time, it was circular reporting, if you will. These same group behind the dossier was briefing reporters, and some of these stories were being used to help lend credibility to the dossier.
So the process was sort of happening in reverse. Normally, reporters get material from the FBI. In this case, the FBI and maybe the Department of Justice were looking at media reports and going to the court and saying, hey, we need this warrant.
Well, we need to see what it says exactly, but the limited information I've been able to get is that media reports were used to lend credibility to the dossier, and what we know is that during that same time frame, Fusion GPS and the British spy Christopher Steele were actively briefing members of the media about their findings. So the thing to look at in the memo is whether the reporters who are being briefed by Fusion GPS and Glenn Simpson, whether any of their reporting shows up in the FISA applications.
What will be interesting, Catherine, is how intelligence agencies and the court system overall will be dealt with moving forward. Because for a warrant to be issued without credible information to lead to that warrant, that just points out a glaring fault in our court system in order to prevent this from happening again. So basically, you had false information that clearly wasn't vetted properly in order for this to happen, and it wound up in something that ultimately heads should roll over this.
Well, what I would say, speaking with lawyers who have dealt with cases that include the national security courts, so warrants for the surveillance of American citizens, is think of this as sort of almost the equivalent of the Supreme Court, okay? This is one of the most highly respected secret institutions, and the bar is exceptionally high to obtain a warrant to track the communications of an American citizen who is living inside the United States. And what I have been told through my contacts is that the use of a dossier in any way, this particular dossier, would not in their mind meet the threshold for that level of surveillance. So we need to see the memo, what else it says about the use of the dossier, but our reporting this morning is that it was one factor in the application for a surveillance warrant, and it would not have been obtained if not for that dossier research.
Wow.
We know that the White House has signed off on the release of this memo. It is being now given back to essentially the Intelligence Committee, and they will release it. Is it coming in paper form? Is this an electronic transmission? Do we know, Catherine?
I believe it's going to be posted to the website so that everyone can read it for themselves. And I think there's some contingencies to, in case that website gets flooded, right, to find it through other leaks. But people at home will be able to read it for themselves probably by the end of the afternoon, if not earlier.
Catherine Herridge, our Chief Intelligence Correspondent, busy day in Washington. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we want to please invite you to stay tuned to Fox News Channel and this Fox station for continuing coverage of this story. So the FISA memo is about to be released. It has not, to my knowledge, it has not publicly arrived on the website yet of the House Intelligence Committee. But the testimony from top officials is suggesting that the Trump dossier and the FBI would not have been released. Outnumbered is next. Thanks for joining us. I'm John Scott in New York.